Well, that's just not true. The human body is remarkably inefficient. Yeah, I mean we perambulate, we can get from A to B, but we're not very good climbers, we're not very good hunters, and our infants are utterly useless. So Kyle Butt from World Video Bible School wants to present us with 6 proofs for God's existence. Right off the bat, I'm going to imagine that this is a fundamentalist Christian video. I believe in God. Perhaps not quite as Kyle Butt believes in God, and perhaps I wouldn't argue for the existence of God in the same way, but that remains to be seen. I'm not going to prejudge the video until we've seen it. But before we begin, from a theological point of view, a linguistic argument can be made that God does not, in fact, exist, because we believe, as Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others, that God is the creator of all things. That is to say, that God created everything that exists. If God created everything that exists, all things that exist, then God does not belong to the order of existing things, because God did not create God. So, in this sense, we can say that God does not exist because God does not belong to the order of existence. We might say that God transcends existence and doesn't have existence him or herself. In this manner, a theologian would say that God is being without substance. That said, let's begin the video.
Socrates once stated that we should follow the argument wherever it leads. When we look at the most profound question of life, does God exist? We should certainly follow his advice. When we do, we'll find evidences that show us God is real. Let's look at 6 proofs that show God exists. Number 1, the universe must have a cause.
I think we can agree here. Whether or not this is proof for the existence of God or a God is certainly still debatable, but I don't think it can be debated that the universe must have a cause. Of course, the law of cause and effect says that all things must have a cause. I think he is assuming his own conclusion here. Is that begging the question? Not sure right now. But he is assuming the conclusion. His conclusion is he wants to show that a God exists, and he's pointing to the assumption that everything must have a cause, therefore that must be God. This is a problematic logic, but certainly the premise that the universe must have a cause can be agreed upon by scientists and creationists, religious people and atheists. Yes, it must have a cause, but the answers people arrive at may be quite different.
The most fundamental law of science is the law of cause and effect. And it says that for every material effect we see, there is a cause that came before it or was simultaneous to it, and that is greater than it. The universe is a material effect. So what caused the universe? You see, if you don't believe in a creator, then you have to suggest something like a singularity. That's what is popular today, that there was some type of singularity that exploded in something called the Big Bang. But then when you try to get down to the bottom of what's a singularity, well, what we hear from the scientific community that suggests to us, the cosmologists, they say, well, a singularity was something that popped into existence from nothing.
Okay, that's not quite what a singularity in cosmology means, so we have a problem here. A singularity is when everything was infinitely small and infinitely dense, that there was a time in which, all existence, certainly from the point of view of cosmological physics, would imagine this, is that there was a time when all time, all matter, and all space was in the smallest conceivable, density, the most incredible density. But that doesn't mean that it came from nothing. It was a something. It was infinitely dense, but it was everything. Another reflection here is if this guy is coming at this from a fundamentalist Christian approach, that he accepts the biblical account to be absolutely true. The account offered in the first chapter of Genesis doesn't necessarily say that God created everything ex nihilo, or ex nihilo, from nothing. The opening verses in translation read, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void." The sense of this is that at that moment when God began to create, there was a formless void of material. So in this sense then, the prevailing, I'm not sure if it's the prevailing theory of, the beginnings of the universe in physics. I'm not a physicist. But if this is the prevailing theory of a singularity where everything was infinitely dense, means that, matter, in a sense, always existed, this would conform, at least broadly, to the mythological account in Genesis 1, where when God began to create, there was prior existing material. Let's continue.
Do you know that if there ever were a time when there was nothing, that's exactly what we would have now? The idea that something popped into existence from nothing is...
Again, this is not what physics argues, and it's not quite clear that this is even what the biblical account suggests.
Simply not a scientific idea. You see, they're suggesting that that singularity is somehow natural, but it behaves supernaturally. They say that that singularity wouldn't have followed the...
He's coming to this conclusion from very weak premises, so his conclusion is invalid.
laws of nature. Well then, so what are we left with? We're left with the fact that the universe had a beginning, and it was not a natural cause. It was something above nature. It was something super nature, something supernatural. And so when we see the material effect of the universe, we can know that there was a supernatural creator that caused the universe. Proof number 2.
In principle, I agree with him. I believe in a first mover and a first cause, and that would be the beginning or the basis of my argument for the being of God or for the reality of God. The argument he makes is not the argument I would make, for the reasons I indicated, that it's an invalid logic. But let's move on to argument 2. Maybe sat back a second.
Creator that caused the universe. Proof number 2. Design demands a designer.
Again, we're assuming that the universe does in fact contain design. I imagine we're going down the path of intelligent design here. So just to cut him off at the pass, intelligent design is basically the fundamentalist Christians filling in the God of the gaps. Any areas where perhaps physics or the other sciences are vague on the subject, as you know, science is going to be vague on things, then this is where their argument will fill God in. But ultimately, this is a form of atheism, counterintuitively, because as those gaps disappear, the basis for these people's belief in God has to disappear with it. As science explains away these gaps disappear, and the God of the gaps goes with the gap. Okay, So if the basis for this guy's faith is this argument for intelligent design, then as that is explained away by science, then so too is the entire basis for his faith. So in that sense, this is a form of atheism. I think that is the fundamental weakness of the intelligent design argument. But let's hear his case.
It is a truism that everybody recognizes that this universe looks designed. In fact, when we see the various different aspects of nature, and we see birds and squirrels and trees, and we see all of the things that they do so well, many times we as humans, we try to copy and mimic that design, but often we don't do nearly as well as the design that we see in nature.
I don't think at all that this is a truism that we all see design from what we see. This is perfectly well explained in the logic of natural selection, that which works in nature, and what I mean by works is that which functions to a given end. Let's take the long neck of giraffes, for example. We could say that this is design, that these horse-like creatures have very long necks, and it shows the perfect design that they can eat from trees that are very high off the ground. Or we could look at the logic of natural selection, that horse-like creatures did not have long enough necks to eat from the trees and so died out. Those with longer necks were more successful at eating from the high trees, and the ones, of course, that were successful with the longer necks passed on those genes to the next generation. Those that weren't successful died before they were able to breed, and natural selection allowed for the genetics of animals with longer necks to become the prevailing type of that species in its evolutionary development. That is a kind of design, but whether or not it conforms to a plan from the start is an incredibly weak rationale.
We look at the design of the human body and the human hand and the arm and the leg and the brain, and we see that those are some of the most advanced, technologically savvy pieces of equipment ever put together, and we try to mimic them and copy them, and we can't do it as well. Why? Because this universe exists.
Well, that's just not true. The human body is remarkably inefficient. Yeah, I mean, we perambulate, we can get from A to B, but we're not very good climbers, we're not very good hunters, and our infants are utterly useless in the wild for very long periods of their growing into adolescence. From a state of nature argument, we are not particularly well designed. We're certainly not well designed to live in a state of nature in the wild. We can't outrun most things. We're not really great predators. Yeah, well, arguably, we're not really designed for the world we live in. But, yeah.
Exhibits design from the starry sky at night to the fingertips on your hand. The design is overwhelming. It's everywhere. Where does design originate?
If we're to argue that we can see design in the stars in the sky at night, well, what we know about the universe is that, they're not situated in any particular pattern. They're not the same distance from us. This is like a blood splatter design conforming to, the movement of various gravitational forces. the design that we see in the sky at night is something that our own brain produces because of its very human need to see patterns. So if he's making this an argument for design, then he's also kind of making, astrology part of that mix, which is hokum. So again, I suspect a very weak line of argumentation here.
Well, what you and I both know is that when you see things that function and they're complex, that design comes from an intelligent designer. Big explosions just simply don't bring about order. They don't cause things that are functional and complex to.
Okay, this is a weak argument, that he is reducing the Big Bang. Again, I'm not going to pretend to know the physics of Big Bang Theory, though it was a brilliant show on television. I watched every episode. But we're not talking about a massive explosion and the universe coming instantly fully formed from it. Yes, explosions are highly destructive. An explosion from a singularity at the beginning of the universe would be extremely destructive. Everything coming out of it would be extremely white hot and no life would be possible, etc. This is true. But we are extending this across almost, and at least for all intents and purposes from our point of view, infinite space and infinite time, the infinite spread of the universe into a vast, vast space over vast periods of time with cooling and change. And yes, when we speak about change and the laws of physics happening over this vast period of time, over this vast extent from this singularity, then yes, complexity is very much possible. With, vast amounts of time and vast amount of possibility, all sorts of complexities can emerge. And some of them will be, as we've just discussed about evolution, some of those will be very functional.
To come into existence. The design we see in the universe demands a supernatural, intelligent designer.
No. Something only needs to be functional in nature to pass on to the next generation. So in a sense, these are happy accidents. Lots of happy accidents over a huge expanse of time will simply die out, but they have a better chance of passing on to the next generation because they are the happy accidents are the ones that are more successful at eating and breeding, etc. The ones that aren't, useful or functional simply die out. And after a long period of time, what we see in the end is something that certainly looks designed for the environment that it inhabits.
Proof number 3. Life demands a supernatural life giver.
False.
You see, in the material world, we have come to understand that there is a law of biology called the law of biogenesis. Law of biogenesis simply says this, that in this material, natural world, life comes from previously existing life of its own kind.
Again, this is God of the Gap stuff. It is absolutely the case that biologists can't determine with any certainty where life started or how life starts. Life hasn't been created out of inanimate material in a test tube. All of that's true. But this does not mean that this can't be discovered. And again, we're looking at the insertion of supernature into something that may well be naturally explained at any time. This is a dangerous type of theology. Essentially, this is a theology because this is an argument for the existence of God, from poorly understood science on the part of the speaker here and on the part of the science, because we're, the science community isn't there yet.
Now, when we look at how people used to think about life, they said, no, life can arise spontaneously from non-living chemicals. And yet every single biological experiment has shown us that that simply is biologically impossible. Life doesn't arise from non-living chemicals.
It's not impossible, it just hasn't been shown how it works yet. That's not the same as impossible. To argue that someone could not run faster than a mile in 1 minute because no one has ever done that before is not a statement that says that this is impossible. Because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it's impossible. Someone now has run more than a mile in a minute. In fact, that's been broken by quite some time, and now that is a possibility. So everything is impossible until it's not.
From where did life arise? Where did life originate if it doesn't arise from non-living chemicals? You see, the idea that there's no God suggests to us that there had to be some singularity without a cause that exploded, and that explosion brought about design, which we've never, ever seen happen. And then ultimately, somewhere the non-living chemicals gave rise to life. But that's biologically impossible. Life did.
All of these premises and conclusions are logically wrong. I think that's all that needs to be said, that they're wrong. And I'm saying that, as someone who believes in God,
demands a supernatural creator. Proof number 4. Moral law demands a moral law giver.
Let's hear what he's got to say before I have my rant.
If some things are objectively morally right, and other things are objectively morally wrong, then there must be a God. You see, if we evolved from primordial slime over multiplied millions of years, at what point did objective moral values arise? We don't look at a dog and say that that dog objectively, morally violated some rule when he steals a bone from another dog. We don't say, hey, he violated a objective moral value. We just don't say that. But we do say that humans can perpetrate things that are objectively morally wrong, that humans can be involved in things that are morally right. If that's true, there must be a God.
In a sense, I believe he is onto something here. For me, I would speak about, my belief in God stemming essentially from the moral, ethical argument. However, the case he is making here is that because moral law exists, there must be a God. The argument against this is that morality in human society, and human beings are social animals, is a product of power relations. That the law, or the nomos, is the narrative of power. Law exists in human society as a product of power structures and power relations. The law itself has to have an arbiter. That arbiter would be the person or people or establishment with the strength to enforce that law. By extension, it can be argued that the same is true of morality, that we live as social animals within a social herd, and that part of our herd instinct, which is a product of our social evolution, has produced in us a hard-wiring sense of social fairness that, like natural selection, allows for us to fare better in a human society, because those who don't fare well in a human society end up not part of the society, and over the long history of human society that generally meant death. So in these simple terms, I wouldn't allow for the moral argument to prove God's existence either. Now we're on to free will.
Proof number 5, free will exists. The atheistic idea that there is no God is founded on the idea of materialism, the idea that this material world is all that there is, all that there was, and all that there ever will be. Because of that, atheism has to suggest that you as a person don't really have free will, that there is no being inside of your body or brain that is super matter, that really what's going on in your brain is just electrons bouncing around and you're the product of those bounces, and you don't really make decisions on your own. It's just the physical laws and properties going on in your brain.
I'm not entirely sure that this is a good articulation of the meaning of free will. Free will is deeper than a simple matter of choice. We could say that by and large human beings do not have free choice. You know, I can't choose to be the King of England. I can't choose to be President of the United States. I can't choose to be an elephant. There is a difference between freedom and necessity. I have certain freedoms in my existence, as do you, that I'm free to choose between a banana or an apple for something to eat, but my necessity means that I can't fly because I don't have wings. Right, so choice and free will are different things. Choice, I think it can be argued that we don't entirely have free choice. There are plenty of things we can't really choose. Can I choose, not to work for a living? Well, then I go hungry. So that's not really a choice. Free will is something that happens at a much deeper level than this. And I think he is the type of free will he's describing here is something entirely a materialist atheist can accept. That it's a matter of free will for the materialist and the atheist to say that there is no God, that they don't believe in God, or perhaps choose to believe in God. That is also an expression of free will. So I'm not entirely sure Kyle is understanding that difference really well. Maybe I made it more confusing with my discussion about choice, but carry on.
If you are watching this video of your own volition, then the fact of the matter is there has to be a God that...
Again, that's not really what free will is. So because I'm choosing to watch this, there has to be a God. That is a truly bonkers simplification of free will and a truly insane reason for the existence of God.
That can account for that free will that you as a person have. There has to be a God if there is free will. And proof number 6, human reasoning. You see, we reason on a regular basis. We understand abstract ideas. If we were products of blind, chance, random processes over multiplied millions of years, reasoning and the laws of reasoning...
Well, before we get on to the laws of reasoning, basic human reason doesn't necessarily require the existence of a God and a creator. Again, this can be argued from simple natural selection, that the complexity developed in the human mind allows for us to make observations and spot patterns in our environment, and these have been exceptionally useful to us, that fire can burn us, that snow will make us cold, that, flooded rivers can kill us, that, a lion in the long grass is not to be approached and petted. Yes, human reason I think is pretty well explained by the natural selection already described. And those elements or those other human beings who never managed to contribute to our present gene pool simply died out because they lacked the smarts to, to avoid lions.
Reasoning simply would have no explanation. And yet we reason together on a regular basis. From where does reason arise? It's got no naturalistic, atheistic explanation. Antony Flew.
My dog was figuring out gravity the other day, and I don't mean to be flippant here. My little 2-year-old dog was running up and down the stairs with his bouncy toy, fascinated by the fact that it bounced down the stairs. And I'm pretty sure in his much more limited capacity to reason than my own, I'm not entirely sure that's correct all of the time, but anywho, he understands that he needs to run up the stairs for it to fall down the stairs. He doesn't expect it ever to roll up the stairs. He's figured that much out. And I'm pretty sure, that doesn't prove to him the existence of God. And the Antony Flew argument, even before we got onto this, is again a load of rubbish. Antony Flew was, an outspoken atheist, scientific philosopher for most of his life, who finally came around to the idea that there must be a supernatural first mover behind the universe. But he specifically outruled the possibility of that God being knowable. Antony Flew is a deist, not a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew, and explicitly denied the possibility of those things. Prove me wrong.
The atheist who wrote Theology and Falsification, the most popular atheistic paper for the last 100 years, the last century.
No, the God delusion was much bigger. Probably not as good, because Richard Dawkins is a fairly rubbish atheist. But no, I'm pretty sure the God delusion was much more, or much bigger and more influential.
In 2006, he co-wrote a book titled There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Became a
Notorious atheist? Why is he on the FBI's most wanted list?
Believer. He stated that his rule of life had always been to follow the evidence where it leads. And he said he followed that evidence. And it led him to the conclusion that there is a supernatural, intelligent God. Let's let the evidence lead us to that same conclusion.
Thank you. That was very good. I'm not entirely sure any of those 6 proofs amounted to an actual evidence for the existence of God. First of all, as I opened, I would argue against the existence of God, and I say that as someone who believes in God. I don't believe that God belongs to the order of existence, because the God I believe in created everything that exists, and God never created him or herself. I believe that God is transcendent and is perfect being without substance, perfectly consistent with Christian and Jewish understandings of the transcendence of God. Also, the danger of looking for proofs for God. If we could prove the existence of God, then this God that has been proven enters into the realm of knowledge, and if God can be known in a scientific way, then this is no longer faith. We are asked to believe in God, and to some extent that requires a belief without evidence. In that sense, it enters into the realm of philosophy and our own, subjective experience of reality and how this leads us to God. In that sense, it's personal. It was a very well presented video, very colourful, but inconsistent, logically flawed, and coming at this from a theological and a philosophical background, it was wanting. It didn't prove much. Thanks for watching.